Hello from Steelcase, and what we'd like to do really quickly is give you a glimpse into our latest research around helping workers work better. Now, as we think about the future of work, where I'd like to start is talking about organizational ambitions, or said another way, business drivers. What are our clients trying to solve for? And all of our clients, top 4 business drivers right now are growth and innovation, and culture and behavior, and digital transformation, and talent management. And as we think about keeping the end in mind, we've got to gather together in buildings and come back to work to solve for those things. Now, what we'd also like to do is share with you our research around what it means to work better, and therefore we'd start with some of the things that we're learning. For instance, we're learning what our future might hold and whether or not we might have a hybrid future. And what does hybrid even mean? We'd also like to share with you, I think, the crux of the problem that we're trying to solve, and it's solving for the 5 things people need. Fundamentally, that people need to change and to work through the change that we're going through. And then finally, we'd like to share with you some design principles that we could put into play to create spaces and applications that are designed to help solve for those business drivers. So we look forward to the opportunity, and we'll see you soon.
Accessible architecture is good architecture. It creates places for all people, makes everybody feel comfortable and welcomed. When I started in architecture, I wasn't really interested in focusing on my disability, but on what I loved, which was making things. As time went on, I discovered that I had a particular perspective that not everybody shared, and maybe you could even say a line of sight that was unique. I think architects want to make things accessible. They may just need some guidance on how the best way is to do that. As we age, our abilities all change, and we will benefit from those things that we call, accessible features. So really, this is it for everybody. People might say, the city doesn't work for me. Well, what's the best way to make impact on that, right? Is to be involved in the design of our cities. And I think architecture is like the best way to do that.
With that, I'd like to welcome Karen to speak to our membership. Hey, Karen.
Hi. Thank you so much for having me. And well, congratulations to you on on your Young Architects Award. That's a big achievement. So great to hear. Thanks so much for including me in your list of awesome speakers this year. I'm going to present to you from my home here in Seattle, and I acknowledge that I am a guest on this land, home of the Duwamish and Coast Salish people. I'm going to start today by sharing 3 questions I often get asked. What was life like for a person with a disability prior to the passage of the ADA? What buildings do I think successfully go above and beyond the regulations? And what still needs to be done to assure great access? So what was life like prior to the ADA? Well, thinking back 40 or 50 years ago, I would say that people with disabilities like me, we did not expect the environment to adapt to us. We thought we had to make the change. We had to adapt. My first inclination that maybe that didn't need to be true actually was when I started architecture school. I walked into design studio and I was faced with a sea of tall drafting tables and stools. And I'm sitting in my wheelchair and I'm looking up at those and going, ooh, this is gonna be a challenge. But I had some really creative and engaging classmates. The end of studio, They went out, they bought some supplies, they came back, they pried the top off one of those drafting tables, and they built me a new base. And all of a sudden, I had this table, right size for me, and I was ready to go. I was totally capable of engaging in design studio. So that was really my first concrete example that changing my environment could change my abilities. Now I'd like to share my screen. So let's see if I can do that. Awesome. I'm hoping that you're seeing my screen. So let's talk a little bit about history. So history is about story. Um, Stories about how things were, about change, and how a particular change came to be. So let's talk about the Americans with Disabilities Act and other legislation. So really, it's important to think back about where it came from. So here we have a picture of World War II veterans. They were living even with their injuries at a much higher rate. They came back from the war wanting just to be able to participate in community and be engaged the way they were prior to their injuries. They decided to advocate for their rights. They ended up getting the service benefits that they were offered, but they started a movement. More and more people got involved, and really it started after the veterans, parents of children with disabilities who are advocating for access to education. They wanted their kids to be involved, to be able to go to school. Those children grew up and they became the voice of advocacy. In the 60s and 70s, this really sort of took flight and the movement was gathering steam. They were advocating for access not only to education, to transportation, to buildings, to everything that would allow them to be a part of the community. And in 1990, which is 30 years ago last summer, almost 31 now, the ADA was passed. And yet, even today, full accessibility is not a given, but we're working on it. It's important to know that people with disabilities continue to advocate professionally and personally for change that supports true diversity, equity, inclusion, and full accessibility. Ooh, and now is when I really want to encourage you. If you haven't yet had an opportunity to watch the documentary Crip Camp, it's running on Netflix, I think, still. And actually, I believe it's up for an Academy Award for documentary. It follows the history of the disability rights movement, and it is such an engaging and powerful story behind the people who said, well, we can do this. We should be able to do this. And they did. So I encourage you to look at it. Crip Camp, really fun. So people with disabilities, we are considered a minority, right? But we're actually a really, really big minority. 1 out of 4 adults in the United States have a disability. That's like 61 million people. And that's not counting anyone under the age of 18, right? That number is going to continue to rise as our population ages. So there are lots of people who benefit from things that we identify as features that support people with disabilities. Think about it. You might have a young person in your family who rides in a stroller. Parents who are pushing strollers really benefit from the same features that those of us who use mobility devices do. So there is actually a definition of disability, a technical definition. It's a physical or mental condition that limits your movements or activities, or it might limit your senses, such as hearing or vision. So the words disadvantaged or handicapped are used in a legal context, but they are not considered appropriate terms socially to describe disability. Disability, I think that term has lost its negative edge. Actually, there's a whole movement within the disability community to like consider disability as a prideful word, to say that, to say, yes, I am a person with disability and be proud of it. I'd like the word disability to be something that inspires like your creative urge to figure out how to remove barriers, how to solve the problem that might be facing you. So use it as incentive, as an opportunity. It's also important to recognize that environmental barriers impact our sense of our ability. Not only am I a wheelchair user, but I'm hard of hearing, wear hearing aids. If you were to sit in a room with me, just one-on-one, you would probably have no idea that I had hearing loss, because I can communicate very well and understand you speaking very well. But you put me in a noisy restaurant. Ooh, back in the days when you could eat in a restaurant, haven't done that in quite a long time here in Seattle. But if you put me in a noisy restaurant, a lot of background noise and stuff, I am acutely aware that I cannot follow a conversation. To me, that environment is disabling. And so thinking about how we can alter our environment to allow people to utilize their abilities to the best that they can, that's our job as architects. And it's also important to recognize that there are lots of different terms that people use around the concept of accessibility. You might hear about inclusive design, universal design, human-centered design. These are all pretty much the same thing. It's about creating environments that engage and enhance an individual's abilities. Now, for those of you who are out working in the world, you know that there are codes and regulations around accessibility and that they change. And a lot of people are like, well, why would that happen? Because there are, people with disabilities, we're just the same, right? Well, actually, one of the great things that's happened about getting us with disabilities out into the community is that now there's a much more diverse options for how to do that. So if you think back to that picture of the World War II vets, they were all sitting in pretty much the same wheelchair. When I was a kid, there was one wheelchair manufacturer, and there were like, I don't know, 3 or 4 sizes of wheelchairs. So how someone engaged with the world was pretty well defined. You knew pretty much what size they were in, when they came into your building. Well, now, wow, the diversity of options is amazing. So you can have little, like the second one on the left, little lightweight manual wheelchairs. Those guys turn on a dime and your footprint is really small. All the way to the one on the right, that's a powered wheelchair with an elevating seat, and that can actually recline. That is that's a liberating device for the individual who uses it, but it can certainly impact the amount of space that you need to include in your building to accommodate someone. So pay attention to the actual space that you provide, and when it's possible to provide more, do. So really, we're talking about everyone wanting to be involved and living a full life in their community, and that's why the ADA was passed. But so the start of it all was the passage of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, Section 504. And this was groundbreaking legislation because it specifically prohibited discrimination on the basis of disability. Now, this was specific to the federal government. So programs conducted by federal agencies, programs that got federal funding, employment by the federal government, and the employment practices of federal contractors. So that's a good start, right? But it doesn't really go far enough. People with disabilities wanted everything to be covered by something like Section 504. So they passed the ADA. The ADA prevents discrimination, but in a much broader context. It covers all employment, not just employment that is funded by the federal government, state and local government services. So if you wanted to be able to go into your town hall to pay your power bill, the town hall needed to have an accessible route to get you in there. Public accommodations, and this is the most powerful section. A public accommodation is any place that welcomes the public in. So this could be your movie theater, your daycare center, your doctor's office, your florist. All of those are required to provide accessible public service and public access. Commercial facilities, transportation, and telecommunications. Think about it. This is the broad range of services and facilities that allow us to engage with our community. One thing that makes the ADA very different than the building code is that it addressed existing buildings. You know, in a building, in the building code, if you build a building and it was considered permittable at the date it was built, if you're not making any change to it, you don't need to from then on. Under the ADA, there was an ongoing obligation by building owners, or there continues to be an ongoing obligation by building owners to assess their building, determine what barriers exist, and then make a plan for how to remove those. The Department of Justice, which is the U.S. Federal agency that passed the ADA, they have created a set of priorities that pretty much start with sort of outside the building and moving in. You have to be able to get in the front door. You have to be able to get to the area of primary function. In your movie theater, that would mean you have to have an accessible front door. You should have access to the seating at the movie theater. Then next, you might have access to the place where you're going to buy your popcorn or use the toilet room. And simple upgrades, things like if your building had all doorknobs and you should put on lever handles, simple and easy to fix things should be done right away. Now remember, that was passed 30 years ago. So you would think by now that we would have all of our buildings 100% accessible. Not quite there yet, right? Or at least the ADA does impact new construction. And in new construction, you're going to start with the assumption that everything you build must be 100% accessible. That's the way the ADA is written. all of the requirements are based on the assumption that we are working towards 100% accessible buildings throughout the US. And then there are some exceptions with some reasonable exceptions within that allow some areas of your building not to be accessible. But also remember that all building uses must be accessible. Thinking, many people sort of argue with me about, well, a fire station is a great example. They might say, firefighters, their job is to be able to run up, 10 flights of stairs with a big thing of fire hose on their back. You're not ever gonna hire a wheelchair using a firefighter. So we don't need an elevator in our fire station. Well, it's important to realize that you're building for the life of the building. And you're thinking, that building we hope is going to be there 50, maybe 100 years. And what is the chance that the use of that building might change over time? So maybe in your community, you can think of a former fire station that's being used as a community center or a small town library, or maybe now it's privately owned and it's somebody's architecture office. Well, those uses all need accessibility. So it's more efficient, cost efficient, and green to put the access in from day one, no matter what the use is. So we talk a lot about codes, and today I'm even going to get into a little bit of detail. It's not important that you remember the numbers specifically, but it's really important that you know where to go to look for them. I talk to students a lot, and they get kind of all about, like, how do we know it's 18 inches on the pull side of a door, 24 inches here, and how high, and it's too much. And I say, great, don't memorize it. I want you to know where to go to look. And this website, ada.gov, I think is like the one that you want to have bookmarked on your computer. And it's important to know when you get in there and you're looking at the actual document and all the numbers and all the explanation is there. It's important to remember that there are two sections, or they call them titles, that address slightly different facilities. So if you're doing anything that has to do with state and governmental agencies, then you would want to be sure that you're looking at Title II. If you're doing a public accommodation or a commercial facility, you want to be looking at Title III. So just keep in mind that you need to know what sort of building you're working on, and you really want to drill into what regulation is appropriate for your project. The other thing to pay attention to is that while there's been a lot of work in terms of aligning the model codes and the federal regulations, they're not completely aligned yet. So when you do a new project, you are certainly going to be looking at the federal regulations, and you need to look at your state codes. And then you align them and you look for what is the most stringent requirement. And that's what you need to be working on. So regrettably, you do have to look at two books. And the other difference between the ADA and building code is that when you do a project in your local in your local area, and you submit documents to the building department, the building department reviews that and comes back and gives you, yep, you're approved to proceed for construction. Everything's okay. Then if you start construction, there are inspectors from your local jurisdiction that come out. And as you complete your construction, they say, yes, you're approved, and they give you a certificate of occupancy. And that's how you know if you've met the requirements for the building code. Regrettably, there's nothing like that for the ADA. There's no inspection, there's no plans review. So it's important to know that unfortunately, one of the ways that you discover that you might not have met the requirements are after someone complains. So there's value in having a specialist look at your plans to help you give you some confidence that you have met all the requirements. I think that the ADA has one of the most powerful impacts on architecture, and that it's made it for the better. Let's show you some examples right now. This is Seattle City Hall, and what you're looking at is a bridge that spans over a very large atrium. And you can see in the left of the photo, there's a big set of stairs that goes from that atrium up to the upper level at the head of the bridge. You know, I kind of not so sure what people are so excited about stairs. Really, you know? I guess when I was in architecture school, I was always sort of struggling with, why do people do that? Put a huge set of stairs up at the front of, a courthouse or something. And I think, there's all this myth about people get up to the top and then they have this amazing view out. Well, I can't participate in that, but I can participate in the excitement of a bridge. The idea that as you move along, you see down, everybody who's on that bridge gets that same awe-inspiring experience. So I love this feature, and I love bridges. Now, this is certainly a fantasy pool, right? Not everybody can afford this kind of beautiful pool. But I wanted to share this with you because I think it's a beautiful example of accessible design. So can you see that? I mean, can you figure out how it's accessible? Well, I knew it right away. So let me talk you through that. So on the left-hand image, you can see the shallow ramps that come down from the courtyard of the house down to the pool deck under this nice little shaded enclosure. On the right-hand image, can you see the ramp that comes down towards the right of the picture and creates a lower seating area that's about 18 inches lower than the edge of the pool deck? As a wheelchair user, I could pull up right alongside that, make a horizontal transfer, and right into the water. So much easier to get out of the pool when you don't have to get up, like on this left-hand side, all the way from the floor up into your chair. This is amazing and beautiful. So accessibility doesn't need to be unattractive. It can be beautiful. Here's another example, I think, of beautiful accessible design. So sometimes if you are following the rules and regulations in building code or accessibility code, you can create something that's accessible but not completely inclusive. The rules around bars tell us that when you build a bar, you must have an accessible section. Typically, bars are set the top of the bar at 42 inches. That would mean you'd have a section that's at 34, right? So now you have some people sitting up here and that wheelchair user sitting down here. Gosh, when you go to a, for the evening, you want to hang out with your friends, you don't really want to be like separated in height then. This is a project deep dive in Seattle that I worked on with some colleagues at Grand Baba. We had a really exciting opportunity. The space came with 2 floor levels. So we used that to our advantage. And if you can see my cursor at the very left end of the bar, that's at a higher floor height, and that bar height is 34 inches, an accessible height. And then the floor drops down, and the remainder of the bar is at standard bar height, 42 inches. And here, it's inclusive. Everybody's sitting kind of eye to eye. And that is such a win-win experience. I do want to point out, because some people have said to me, well, okay, so you can't get to this lower area because there's stairs here. But I want to assure you that this area to the right is a ramp, and that there's an opening behind this wall. And so if you wanted to come in and sit with your friends who are sitting at the banquette, you can do that too. So I think that's another beautiful example of accessibility. So this is the Hunters Point Community Library. This building was built about a couple of years ago, or opened, I should say, a couple of years ago. So it's a relatively new project. And it was highly touted by the architecture press. It is a very dramatic building, and one that has provided a lot of community benefit. But I want to question a few things about it. As you can see in this photo, this section of book stacks is only accessible by stairs. That means a portion of the community can't go and browse for their, latest beach read. They have to ask a librarian to help them. And I think this flies in the face of the idea of access for all. So my question to you is a building great public architecture if not everybody can use it? This is the Ed Roberts campus in Berkeley, California. And I gotta tell you, that ramp is super fun to run down. I know, I've done it. It's a very dramatic expression of accessibility. And it certainly is very creative. And what I think what made this sort of turn out to be this great example is certainly very creative designers. But this project engaged people with disabilities to a very high extent. The building is home to many disability-related organizations, and individuals with disabilities were very involved in the design of the project. So I think that made a very significant difference in the expression of accessibility in the building. And so I want to encourage you, if you design a project that has like a spectacular accessibility feature, or even one maybe that's not quite as dramatic as this, I encourage you to pitch it to the architectural press. It's important that we show examples in our media of great accessibility. It's one way of sort of being a design activist, right? So the renovation of this existing space really jumped out at me when I first saw it, because this singular decision was made that helped people who are blind to move comfortably through the middle of this wide open plaza. And you know what? That's really unusual. People who are blind need a tactile reference point in order to navigate through space. And that's often the intersection between a wall and a floor plane, a curb line, or potentially an edging between landscape and hardscape, something like that. But when you have a large open plaza, those reference points are around the outside of the space. And so they have to kind of go the long way around and aren't able to cut through the middle, do a shortcut, like those of us who have vision. The designers here installed a contrasting strip in the ground, in the floor surface. It contrasts both in texture and in color to the surrounding material, and allows people who use a white cane to travel to navigate through the middle of this space. And so this one difference resulted in a thoughtful example of accessibility. So when we think about accessibility, it's really important that we don't limit ourselves to just thinking about mobility, that we recognize that we have folks that have not only might have mobility issues, but don't use a device. So people who are slow walkers, folks who are pushing strollers, as I mentioned before. But it's also people in the blindness and low vision community, people who are deaf or hard of hearing or have other sensory conditions. It's really important to provide information and to be able to engage everyone using multiple senses and experiences. And this interpretive center for the Amazon spheres here in Seattle, it also is a multisensory experience, and people with disabilities were involved in the design process. So this gets us to difference. And, I think different has always been sort of a questionable term that people worry a little bit about, but it's important to know that we're at the beginning of a transformation in terms of thinking of whether being different is positive or negative. And really, it's just the way things are. So, can a mix of non-typical bodies be accommodated in public space? Mixed design, and others certainly think so. What we're looking at here is an alternative to today's typical airport restroom. Without a doubt, you've already started to see some of these changes in public spaces, maybe in your communities. But it's important for us to talk about why this is a critical change. This open space design is based on the desire of people who are differently embodied to be accommodated in a more equitable and less stigmatizing way than having to use separate but equal accessible facilities like you often see at large assembly spaces. Here you see accessible design at its best. Open space, it's safe, easy to use, and provides lots of turning radius. It welcomes all gender identities, and it provides choice in the heights of toilets and sinks and mirrors. And with that, we're going to look at an accessible mailroom in Brooklyn. So this is our opportunity to spread the love and share our profession's definition of diversity. We've been talking about design and how architects can creatively address different needs. A good example of this is like this mailroom in Brooklyn. But there's another point of diversity that I'd really like to talk about. When it comes to diversity, people with disabilities are practically invisible in architecture and related professions. I firmly believe that if our profession is committed to reaching the next level of design excellence, we need to change this. How would we do that? Well, Architecture schools must make a dedicated effort to increase diversity by reaching out and welcoming students with disabilities. Architecture firms must be encouraged to increase diverse perspectives by hiring and supporting the careers of architects with disabilities. And the AIA, an organization that represents its members, needs to make a significant commitment to changing this lack of representation through education and outreach, and by offering scholarships to students with disabilities. And I'm going to ask you to think about how you can personally support this critical goal. And so you have the power to create a beautifully accessible world, to be a good designer and a design activist. So you start with the regulations, and then you find creative ways to meet the needs of all people. And in the interest of time, I am going to skip ahead. I had lots of regulations to talk about, but I'm thinking that I'm gonna skip forward. And I'm gonna say that I hope that you will consider access to be a direct opportunity to improve people's lives, and that you will see design as a social justice issue. And with that, I'll open it up to questions.
Okay, hi Karen.
Hi.
Hey, I'm Diana. I'm past president, and I'm going to step in for Michael and go through some Q&A. That was a really inspiring presentation. Thank you so much. That's great.
Yeah, be here. I'm sorry that I always run long.
Oh, it is all good. I think we're right on track. Honestly, we normally end up being a little bit over. So this is perfect. Thank you. You timed it very well. So a few questions that we've got from the audience at large. What do you think is the area where accessibility still has the longest way to go?
Can you say that again?
Yes. What do you think is the area that accessibility has the longest way to go?
Oh, wow. That one's hard to choose because I think it's as a person with a mobility limitation, I'm acutely aware of the areas that I think need to be further detailed in the code around mobility. I think that the codes could continue to fine tune more or provide more clarity around things like toilet rooms and bathing rooms in hotels and things like that. But I do know that within there's just hardly any information that effectively supports the blindness and low vision community, and that's another area that really needs work. But in order to do this, in order to make better change, we need research. We need to know what are the needs of the communities that we're trying to support, and then translate that into language such as code or standard.
Excellent. Well, this is a similar sort of topic. If there's a client who isn't familiar with ADA or designing for folks with disabilities, do you have some advice for architects to speak with their clients and make sure that this is an important part of the design process?
So I think that as architects, our job is to protect the health, safety, and welfare of the community. And a big part of that is to understand and value allowing all of our community into our buildings. So from a sort of a theoretical or values perspective. I think it needs to be a core value in all of our work, and that we shouldn't be explaining it to clients. It is a service we bring, just like being able to keep the roof up and the water out. But we can also, if there really is a big argument, you can lean on the fact that it's the law. So unfortunately, fortunately and unfortunately, there are legal implications to not complying. So I would like us to be doing it first and foremost because of the social benefit, but really it's the law.
Right. It's a great reminder. So in that same topic, how would you recommend that architects incorporate accessibility as a crucial part of the design process? I assume this is something you should be talking about through every phase of design.
I think of it as I said, a core value. And I think that putting it on the table at the very beginnings of conceptual design or its schematic design can really make it so much easier to incorporate comfortably in your design work. So I don't know what the landscape is like in your community, but here in Seattle, it's very hilly. And most of the projects that we work on have terrain issues. If you place or site your building effectively, thinking about making sure that people can easily get in the door, so placing the building so that maybe the entrance is at the most level part of the site, that can go a long way to making the project so much easier rather than putting the building in a place and then later going, oh, I need to be able to get a wheelchair user in there. Well, now we're going to have to do this really big ramp and all this stuff. Maybe if you had cited it differently, that wouldn't be the case.
Right. And I would think talking to your landscape architect and making sure that they understand that this is an important goal of the project would be a piece of that as well. Okay, great. So let's see. It would seem accessibility will become more prevalent as the population ages and many become seniors. Do you expect that change to happen?
Well, I am already seeing a difference in the years that I've been practicing in terms of the number of clients who are asking for private residences, even at a young age, that will allow them to stay in their home for the lifespan. And I think if people are thinking about it in their private homes, then they certainly are looking for it out in the community. And we don't do a lot of private residential work, but I work with a lot of architects who do, and I think I've seen a significant change in the last 10 to 15 years. And gosh, even in the sort of in the home magazine kind of press, there's a lot of interest in making things accessible or aging in place or lifespan homes. Whatever the phrase is, it's all good. It just means we're increasing the stock of buildings that are available for everyone.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And the more common it becomes, then it's no longer this conversation we have to have. It's just the thing that we do. Okay, can you share additional resources that help define universal design?
I'm sorry, can you ask that again?
Do you have any specific resources that you could point us to that help define universal design? And maybe the answer is working with the consultant. And that's okay.
Yeah. So universal design is a design philosophy that encourages analysis of your design work to be to get it to be like usable by the broadest number of people possible. The difference between universal design and, say, accessible design is that accessible design has actual definitions, and it will tell you, you know, the size and the shape and how many and all that stuff. Universal design is a little bit more flexible than that. And so if somebody is looking for resources specific to universal design, there are a number of organizations that I encourage you to look at. The Institute for Human-Centered Design in Boston is a great resource. There's the SUNY Buffalo, State University of New York, Buffalo, has a certificate course on universal design that is very highly regarded, and I wish I could tell you the link for that, but if you Google SUNY Buffalo and universal design, I'm sure you'll find it. And then there are a number of other organizations that are trying to promote the values of universal design. So it's just important to recognize that it's not exactly the same as accessible design.
Okay, thank you for that. What was the name of the Netflix show that you mentioned earlier on?
Oh, it's CRIP Camp. So CRIP camp, like summer camp. And oh man, so you know, CRIP is a word that you would you might use about yourself, but you wouldn't use about somebody else. But it is a it is a very powerful story that highlights the sort of remarkable individuals who took it upon themselves to say, we can do better, and we want, you know, we want what everybody else has, and we can do better. And they worked together. It's just brings tears to your eyes. It's a really great story. I really hope it wins, you know, an award. I mean, wouldn't that be amazing?
Absolutely. Well, we'll all add it to our queue. Thank you for that. Okay, I think we've just got time for a couple more here. Does historic preservation become a barrier to universal and accessible design?
So historic preservation does provide some additional exceptions. So remember, I talked about how all design needs to be 100% accessible. So if you're renovating a building that, or altering a building in any way that has an historic designation, the expectation is you're going to make anything you touch accessible, with some exceptions. And so there are a few more exceptions around historically significant buildings, but it doesn't give you a pass. I know people say, oh, that's an old building, it's grandfathered in. No, that's not the case. There are just a few differences in the way you might approach making those changes. So, and sometimes that's really the kind of project where you want to get a specialist in to help you figure out what the rules really are.
Excellent. So how would one work with a specialist? Is this something that you would extend, you'd extend the branch out early on in design, and you'd have an ongoing conversation, and this could, it seems like it would be a really excellent learning opportunity for any architect who wants to know more, but maybe doesn't have the time to dig in and tap into all these resources like they would like to do.
You know, that's exactly true. There are a number of really great firms across the country that do what we do, and our job, the way we see it, is to really enhance your design, to sort of increase the level of accessibility while maintaining the vision and the quality of your work, right? We recognize that the accessibility regulations are very complicated. And, even I spend a lot of time in front of the books trying to figure out the fine tuning. And if you guys are really trying to make sure that you're, meeting the client's goals, making sure the building stands up, the water stays out, it's a beautiful piece, and it's built on time and on budget. Sometimes it's really helpful to just bring in a partner on accessibility. And we think that the best value is when you bring us in early, where we can help you with things like siting and other issues, ask you those questions to get the project on the right path, and then take you all the way through making sure the details are covered. Because a lot of accessibility is in the details. In the end, where you put the toilet paper in the stall actually is important. I know it sort of seems like, who cares? But we do. So, there are great firms that around the area that can help out. So I encourage you to engage one of them.
That is excellent. Thank you. Well, those are all the big hitter questions. I did just want to compliment you on the really beautiful descriptions of, going across a bridge and describing, accessibility at the pool. Those are images that I think we all experience much differently. And it was really, really nice to hear you kind of take us on this journey that maybe many of us may not even notice as being special. So thank you for that. And anything else? I think this has been a really great presentation. Thank you for your time. Thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you so much. There is a video. I hope that you guys will share with the participants that we weren't able to show this morning because of technical difficulties. But I think it'll also just give flesh out a little bit more about my thoughts on this topic.
Yes, we will. And what we'll do is we'll compile all the resources that you've shared with us in our talk, and we'll send it out to the chapter too. So thank you so much.
Great. Thanks. You all have a great rest of your day.
All right. Take care. Bye, everybody. We'll see you next time.